Thank you for taking the time to come out and speak to us tonight. And Janice, you are welcome to begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Kelly. Pardon me, I had to reach and turn off a heater. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a delight to be with you. And I thank you for turning out in such record numbers for this presentation. I would like to sort of organize this presentation by a couple different features. After a brief introduction, I'd like to talk about the Pennhurst State School and Hospital and its historical and present day significance. It is freighted with meaning and importance, not only in Chester County and Pennsylvania history, but also in national history. I'd like to sort of walk through the arc of Pennsylvania's, or of Pennhurst's story, and then touch on some controversies in the history and in the present, and then open it up for questions and conversation. I find that oftentimes the most meaningful remarks are given in the Q&A. And I know we have any number of folks here tonight who had their own personal and professional stories grounded in the Pennhurst experience. And I hope that they'll take the opportunity to weigh in and to offer some perspective and thoughts. So just a word of thank you. I'd like to thank Kelly and Pam and the staff at the library for hosting this. I would like to thank my co-author and co-editor and friend, Jim Conroy, Dr. James Conroy, who worked side by side with me in assembling this book on the Pennhurst. I'd like to thank our contributors, certainly, and the good folks at Penn State Press who were enormously patient with us as we tried to put it together. Two organizations that deserve special mention are the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, a remarkable advocacy group dedicated to keeping the story of Pennhurst alive and advocating on behalf of people with disabilities in the United States. And the other is PILCOP, the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia, which was instrumental with the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, and not only having a historical marker dedicated to Pennhurst State School and Hospital, but also in the really significant, groundbreaking litigation that occurred that transformed American jurisprudence and our very notion of disability rights and equal citizenship. Dr. Vilas Prabhu, who I saw just join the program, is our retiring provost from Millersville. And Vilas was a great ally in sponsoring several conferences and in supporting the cause of research and the eventual outcome of the book. So I thank him as well. And I thank my wife, Tracy, who puts up with me. Finally, I'd like to mention Thomas K. Gilhool, who was not only a friend and a friend to many on the call, but he was one of the most important civil rights and disability rights attorneys in America. Tom passed away last summer, and he was an enormous influence on me, as he was on many. And he, in many respects, was the initiator of the idea. He planted the seed of the idea, not just for a historical marker, but also for what became this book. So we remember Tom and remember his wife, Jillian, very fondly and gratefully. Doing history is an active remembrance. And I think that's an important point that I'd like to convey to folks, that the book that Jim Conroy and I put together, Pennhurst and the Struggle for Disability Rights, which came out last summer, is in many respects not just a history of Pennhurst and its significance. It is an active remembrance of the people and the place, the controversies, but also the sense of hope that it inspired. And we initially wanted to entitle the book Between History and Hope, stealing a line from the poet Seamus Heaney. But it's just one aspect of history. It is an active remembrance and remembering. There are always two quotes I'd like to begin with, and then we'll jump right into the Pennhurst story. And they inspire not only tonight's talk, but the book and much of the work that has been done to record the history of Pennhurst. One is from Charles Joyner: ask big questions of little places. That is the spirit in which we put together the book. Ask big questions of little places. Pennhurst's history and its meaning and significance resonates throughout American history, and it gives us a chance to rethink what is significant and important in history as a human story, and human beings as the subject of that story. The other quote comes from Arnold Toynbee, the British historian. He said that history is something that happens to people. And that's a thought I would like everybody to ponder as we go through this, and particularly in our discussion. History is not some carcass of facts. It is something that happens to people. And Pennhurst, and for the experiences of 15 or 10,500 people who lived there over almost 8 decades, Pennhurst is a lived experience that is freighted with meaning not only for them, but for us. A brief word about the title of tonight's talk, which will be controversial for some. In 1972, and Kelly, maybe we could go to the newspaper slide, if you would. There it is. In 1972, the Pottstown Mercury published this newspaper article, which stirred enormous controversy, and it came in the midst of controversial litigation and activism, advocacy surrounding Pennhurst. And they titled the piece Pennhurst, The Shame of Pennsylvania. And it is a deeply felt sentiment for folks on both sides of the divide in the discussion of Pennhurst. And this notion that how could something that was intended to be a model institution for the care and treatment of others turn into something else? And if we could go back to the book now. But I thought, not only in an effort to draw an audience, but also to sort of ground this in the near present day, that the title might work. This is the book that Penn State Press published last summer, and you'll see Jim Conroy and I are the co-editors, along with some other contributors who authored chapters, and Dick and Jenny Thornburg, who graciously wrote a foreword. And Dick passed away, of course, several months ago. Pardon me. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of Pennhurst. And perhaps if we could go to Thurgood Marshall's quote, Kelly, this will ground us in exactly what we're talking about here. And it is a statement by Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was a hero in the civil rights movement, who as a Supreme Court justice recognized the very conscious connection between the plight, the condition, the status of people in Jim Crow segregation, and the plight and status and condition of people who were institutionalized, and particularly for folks who had an intellectual or developmental disability. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The parallels. And this is something that Tom Gilhool shared with me when we first met, and it's always stayed with me. And I think that I'm not sure if everybody can see it because the faces are on the screen, so I'll just read it very quickly. This is what Justice Marshall said in a case in 1985. Fueled by the rising tide of social Darwinism, the science of eugenics, and the extreme xenophobia of those years, the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, I should say now, leading medical authorities and others began to portray the, quote, feeble-minded as a menace to society and civilization. A regime of state-mandated segregation and degradation soon emerged that in its virulence and bigotry rivaled, indeed paralleled, the worst features of Jim Crow. Massive custodial institutions were built to warehouse the retarded for life, his phrase. And the aim was to halt reproduction of the retarded and, quote, nearly extinguish the race. This quote, as much as anything I can think of, grounds Pennhurst in time and place and in significance in American history. And what I'd like to do is just talk a bit about the history of Pennhurst and its development over time, and then turn to some of the controversies. The critical period in all of this is 1968 to 1972, when the seedbeds of a revolution and a deep transformation in the life and experience of people with disabilities really took root in the United States. Well, as Justice Marshall's, and maybe we can go to the map that shows institutions, Kelly.
Is that this one? Yes.
Justice Marshall's quote really grounds us in the turn of the 20th century and the origins of Pennhurst. And this is where the book begins, and it's actually in the first chapter. Pennhurst State School and Hospital was originally known as the Eastern Pennsylvania Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. It was a companion institution to the Western Pennsylvania Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic, which we know of today as Polk, which is in Venango County in Western Pennsylvania. Both of these institutions were created in an age of institutions. They were the product of conscious social policy, modern scientific thinking, and what we can think of as a very conservative reform agenda at the turn of the 20th century. You'll see on this map that by 1923, Pennsylvania was supporting either partially or completely 60 different kinds of institutions to care for a whole variety of human conditions that the state took more and more responsibility for. Pardon me. These institutions ranged from state schools and hospitals, as we think of them, to sanatorium, to tuberculosis centers, to facilities that treated folks with alcohol and drug problems, as we would say today, and a whole genre of human problems. For most, the idea was that temporary removal to a different environment would allow for improvement in their condition. There was one group, however, where that seemed not to be possible. And this is the origin of not just Polk, but Pennhurst. Pennhurst flourished in the age of eugenics. Eugenics was a scientific and social movement that gained enormous popularity at the turn of the 20th century. it was, for those who are unfamiliar with the phrase, it was an outgrowth of not only Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, which was published in 1859, and it talked about the struggle for existence, natural selection, and the competitive features of life. But it was more explicitly the direct result of his cousin Francis Galton's book, Hereditary Genius, published in 1869, where Galton proclaimed that hereditary traits shaped human destiny. Some traits were positive, some were not. Some were desirable, some were undesirable. And through creative and selective human breeding, we could improve the race by encouraging the fit and discouraging the unfit. It was not extermination, but it was elimination. This concept of eugenics flourished at the turn of the 20th century, and it provided the ideological and the political foundation for institutions to treat and manage folks who were said to have hereditary feeble-mindedness. And if you go through, and there's a whole language debate that we can't get into tonight, but this idea of the fit and the unfit, the strong and the weak, and a struggle for existence. Some folks are seen as a threat. Others are seen as the ones who will lead society and the race forward. There's a whole genre of literature at the turn of the 20th century about race improvement, race betterment, about weeding out the weaker of the species. As John Rockefeller said, every bush needs a little pruning to grow stronger. This had very practical social and political implications in Pennsylvania and around the country. And you can see on this map here some of the outgrowth of it. This gives the ideological foundation for the age of institutionalization. And the idea that flourished in Pennsylvania and elsewhere was that for folks who had so-called hereditary defect, who were, to use the language of their day, imbeciles, morons, and idiots, mental and moral defectives, social degenerates, and there are a lot of other unflattering expressions as well. We could somehow manage that population out of existence. And this took root, and it had a very strong presence in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania. And by the turn of the 20th century, there's a growing sense that the single great social problem confronting America was what was called the menace of the feeble-minded. In fact, in 1908, the year the Pennhurst opened, Charles Fraser, who was the dean of the Penn Medical School and a leader in Pennsylvania reform politics, wrote a sensational pamphlet, and we talked about this at the beginning of the book, The Menace of the Feeble-Minded in Pennsylvania. I see in the chats references to Nazi Germany. Here's where the Germans got some of their ideas. And there's a very conscious connection between the two. But Fraser wrote this pamphlet, The Menace of the Feeble-Minded. And for Charles Fraser, for a whole host of physicians, public health experts, and politicians in Philadelphia and around the state, eugenics became the justification for creating massive custodial institutions to separate folks who were seen to have hereditary mental deficiencies. And the idea was to separate them out from the mainstream because they posed a threat to society. It wasn't just compassionate care, the model that Samuel Gridley Howe and Dorothea Dix had promoted earlier in the century. Now there's a much more punitive dimension to it. For the welfare of society, some people have to be moved out of the mainstream. And here's the practical impact of eugenics on politics. In Pennsylvania, this message was taken to heart. And advocates of eugenics proposed 3 different solutions for how to make this happen. And they had allies all around the country who were doing the same thing in state after state after state. One of the most popular early strategies for eliminating the unfit was through sexual sterilization. And in Pennsylvania, there were nearly 300 sterilizations that were performed by the end of the 19th century. There was no law that prohibited it, but there was no affirmative consent decree at the same time. And so through sexual sterilization, one could prevent the unfit, deviants, the degenerates, the feeble-minded from reproducing. This proved to be politically untenable. In 1905, a law was passed in the state legislature that sanctioned sterilization. And Governor Pennypacker vetoed it in a very famous veto message. At least 6 other times in the early 20th century, advocates, many of them coming right out of Philadelphia and Eastern Pennsylvania, proposed this idea again and again, that sterilization was a societal tool to eliminate the unfit in the struggle for existence. When this seemed to, it was passed by the legislature twice, vetoed by governors twice, never approved, never sanctioned by state law. But we know that sterilizations were performed in Pennsylvania. None that we found at Pennhurst, I should say that. A second alternative then became, pardon me, the social isolation or segregation of people who had hereditary feeble-mindedness. And here's the rise of institutions as a companion strategy, not giving up on sterilization, but as a companion and more tenable strategy to separate, isolate, and eventually eliminate folks who had hereditary feeble-mindedness. If you could keep them apart, they could not reproduce. It was simple biology. And so in 1897, Polk opened. And then in 1908, Pennhurst opened. And you'll see from the map that there are a half dozen other institutions for the care and treatment of the feeble-minded that opened around the state. And today we're still involved in a controversy over the closing of Polk. Hambright has recently closed. Selinsgrove is still open. So this remains a controversy, the creation of these institutions. Pennhurst opened in 1908 in Spring City on Crab Hill, and it grew tremendously in the decades after its opening. Originally conceived for maybe as many as 500 people, it had in the the mid-1950s, it had 3,500 residents. It had expanded into more than 1,000 acres of land. Not only the campus itself, but adjacent farmlands and a dairy farm and other outbuildings. It grew into a state school, and it had its own infirmary or hospital. And so over time, as there's more and more pressure to bring folks said to have feeble-mindedness into institutions, Pennhurst grew, Polk grew, other centers grew. Between 1908 and 1987, when Pennhurst closed, more than 10,500 people were incarcerated at Pennhurst. It was a custodial congregate institution where most people were committed or placed for life. Once you were there, according to the enabling statute and practice, you couldn't leave. You surrendered your liberty rights. When families would come to visit, they were not permitted back into the residential dormitories for almost all of Pennhurst's history. That changes towards the end. But there was this sense of isolation both within and from without. Pennhurst began as a model institution. And then over time, there was the realization of a series of problems and controversies associated with it. And we can divide this history into a couple phases. Between 1908, when it opened, and 1945, a period of great growth, stalled temporarily by the Depression, and then great expansion. Residents were divided into two different segments or categories: the working residents and the custodial residents. The industrial sector, where people were thought to be able to learn appropriate skills and things to help them adapt in society, and the custodial segment, where people were in need of constant care and attention and likely never would be able to be educated. That was the thinking. It's not a statement by me. That was a thinking. Over time, the balance shifts from one to the other, to the custodial population, as the campus grows and more people are there. Now, Polk had similar size and similar features. Students who could work were expected to work, meaning they would get up in the morning, have a very modest breakfast. They would work in a wood shop. They would work in the laundry. They would work on the dairy farm. They would work in the agricultural fields. They were expected to labor. They had no benefit to no right to the benefits of their labor. Those all went back into the institution. And that's how Pennhurst was able to maintain a profit and return money to the state. Those who could not work, who were judged to be unable to be either educated or to work, were cared for by the staff and oftentimes by fellow residents or inmates. And inmates was a phrase that they used in the day. So down towards the Second World War, this system grew and expanded as Pennhurst grew. Now, one of the great controversies is that by the 1930s, Pennhurst became more than just a state school and hospital, a segregated facility for folks who suffered from feeble-mindedness, mental retardation, what today we would call an intellectual or developmental disabilities. By the 1930s, like many institutions, Pennhurst became medical laboratories where experimentation occurred. That experimentation was often related to the development of pharmaceutical products. And you would have university researchers and other scientists who would gain access to populations at institutions to test drugs and other pharmaceutical therapies. The most famous example of this is Salk experiments for the polio vaccine out at Polk in Western Pennsylvania. But whether it's at Pennhurst, there was research done on influenza, measles, and the mumps. Some discussion about research on hepatitis that's really done in other fields. But by the 1930s, as World War II approaches, there's more and more pressure brought to bear to develop vaccines, and we're living in an age when we're looking for vaccines. More and more pressure brought to bear to develop vaccines for influenza, diphtheria, and a variety of other contagious diseases. Where would university researchers from what is now CHOP, the University of Pennsylvania, Jefferson, and other prominent medical schools, where would they go to find available test subjects? They would go to institutions like Pennhurst. And this was a phenomenon all around the country. And something that we talk about at some length in the book, the rise of medical experimentation and how Pennhurst, like so many other places, became centers, became laboratories to test pharmaceutical products to the benefit of the researchers, to the benefit of the company, to the benefit of the institution, and sometimes to the harm of the residents. One of the great issues that develops is whether residents would have to give their consent. Remember, they are judged to be, quote, feeble-minded. They are wards of the state. They have lost their liberty rights. These discussions around the country and at Pennhurst occurred between the medical directors, who were physicians, and the universities and the pharmaceutical companies. And this decision was made, and there are a series of letters back and forth about this, that it's not necessary to gain consent, let alone informed consent, before people can be tested. And eventually there's a bit of unease about that. So it's, well, maybe we should ask the family. But who should ask the family? The institution said it's the researcher's responsibility. The researchers saw these folks as wards of the state. It's their responsibility. And so the whole issue of consent, it's very complicated. Medical experimentation over a whole range of what are seen as public health issues linger in Pennsylvania into the 1970s, when finally a moratorium is declared and there'll be no more medical experimentation at state institutions. Pennhurst was one of those primary centers for that kind of research. One of the smaller but really significant stories is that during World War II, conscientious objectors were assigned to alternative service during the war. In Pennsylvania, these conscientious objectors, who oftentimes came out of denominations in the historic peace tradition, Mennonites, Quakers, and others, went to institutions like Pennhurst, like Polk, like Byberry, and other institutions state mental hospitals, Harrisburg, Byberry, eventually Norristown, and also institutions for folks with mental retardation. And they wrote articles about their experience and what they saw. And they wrote to President Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt about what they experienced when they were placed there in this alternative service. And this brings to light from within a growing awareness of abuse, which will be one of the great controversies that evolves out of the Second World War. That within these sheltered, isolated, segregated institutions, there was a problem of abuse and neglect and physical harm. And these articles, which appeared in Life and Look magazine and elsewhere, are really compelling. Swarthmore has quite a collection in their college archives. They're really something to read. You can find them online. And so not just experimentation, but now this issue of abuse starts to set in. And in the post-World War II era, one of the most significant developments is the rise of the advocacy movement. Not only in Pennsylvania, but around the country, as mothers and families and different organizations like the ARC begin to take notice and to investigate and to demand greater accountability, greater public exposure, greater awareness in addressing problems that had long persisted at institutions. And in Pennsylvania, this is a remarkable story, and Mark Friedman and Nancy Knoll have a wonderful chapter on this, and the rise of self-advocacy will come out of that. But the advocacy movement begins to point things in a different direction, not towards increased institutionalization, but now the phenomenon of deinstitutionalization and a pushback. And for people like Pat Clapp and Eleanor Elkin, certainly for Ginny Thornburg and others, and mothers groups around the state that went in and investigated at Polk and went in, tried to get into Pennhurst, got into Hamburg and other sites around the state, and then began to write letters and began to organize. And eventually the Arc of Pennsylvania will come out of this. And this pressure from families themselves, and eventually pressure from self-advocates who had experienced Pennhurst, people like Roland Johnson and others, is one of the most significant transformative developments in modern American history. And it lays the foundation for the disability rights movement. And throughout the 1950s and 60s into the 1970s, the development of this network of advocacy, which questioned what was going on at Pennhurst, demanded access. Similarly at Polk, and what they found, they thought was appalling. The care and treatment and neglect was substandard, insufficient, sometimes inhumane. There was abuse and violence, and there were a whole series of institutional problems. And by 1968, everything begins to take shape for a very strong pushback. And here's the great turning point, I think. In July of 1968, a young reporter named Bill Baldini published a produced a 5-night series called Suffer the Little Children, about conditions at Pennhurst. And this played on Philadelphia television 5 nights in a row. And Bill brought to light from within. He insisted and was given access. And he filmed what he saw and he heard. And we have a long interview with Bill in the book. And he explains his experience. And he was shocked and overwhelmed. And eventually, by the end of the week of the broadcast, was just physically and emotionally drained. But this brought to light a crisis from within at Pennhurst. And many folks are familiar with Suffer the Little Children. You can find it on YouTube. You can go to the Pennhurst Memorial Preservation Alliance website. There's a link there. It is startling to watch. It also will inspire a young reporter named Jerry Rivers, whom we now know as Geraldo Rivera, to go to Willowbrook in New York and do the same thing. And all of a sudden, the role of the media in documenting what's going on within the institution, specifically Bill's documentary about Pennhurst, transforms journalism, transforms awareness, and in many respects, transforms American history. And that's not an understatement. It has a tremendous impact around the country. It is also in that time frame from 68 to 72 that this advocacy movement goes to court. And here's the other piece: the rise of legal advocacy on behalf of the residents at Pennhurst. And here's where a whole series of law cases are filed. The Public Interest Law Center in Philadelphia, Judy Gran, Tom Gilhool, Fred Lasky, David Furliger, and others, challenging conditions. The first is the P-ARC case, which is settled in 1971, 1972. And it challenged the notion that students at Pennhurst did not have a right to public education. Based upon the Brown decision, and Judy Grant has a wonderful chapter on all of this in the book. Based on the Brown decision in 1954, the argument was that children should not be denied the right to public education, something that was commonplace for children with so-called mental retardation at the time. And the Park case, as it's known, was groundbreaking. And I know that somebody had a question about home and community services. And here in some respects is the start. The right to education. And Park, and the success of that court challenge, based upon the 14th Amendment, based upon notions of equal citizenship and equal protection under the law, and that students cannot be denied their constitutional rights, as they commonly were. That is followed by Haldeman versus Pennhurst, which is decided in 1977. It's filed shortly after P-ARC is settled and the decision is rendered. And this deals with Terry Lee Haldeman, and it becomes a class action suit that challenges treatment at Pennhurst and the right to appropriate treatment within the place. And I have a whole bunch of notes here, but I'm not even going to get into those notes in terms of the details of the case. Judy's chapter spells it all out. And this idea that it's an expansion of rights of services, and services in the most appropriate setting. That is followed by a separate challenge to the very foundations of labor at Pennhurst. And the Supreme Court will rule that the conditions of labor are not slavery, but peonage. And this is a separate case, a separate state. And that people have a right to compensation for their labor, and the residents at Pennhurst didn't have that right, so it will rule peonage unconstitutional. It's followed by the case of Romeo versus Youngberg in the early 1980s. And the whole question of fair and humane treatment of services. Nick Romeo was a resident at Pennhurst who suffered enormous abuse. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a big expose. We give it a lot of attention in the book. And looking at the phenomenon of abuse and neglect within institutional walls. And again, what Tom Gilhool and David Furliger and then others started now is beginning to expand into a national movement for civil rights for people with disabilities. And you have eventually, you have a whole series of federal laws, statutes that implement and govern rights to education, equal protection, fair and humane treatment, and eventually, and here's the Olmsted decision, 1999, which is based on the Americans with Disability Act, which is a civil rights statute and recognizes the rights of individuals to live in the community and to have community services as are appropriate. And for the person who had a question about home and community-based services, you can draw a direct line from PARC down to Olmsted, and Pennhurst figured in all of that. It also figured in Chief Justice John Roberts upholding the Affordable Care Act. There's a little footnote that referenced Haldeman versus Pennhurst. So what started at Pennhurst comes to have a revolutionary effect on American law and jurisprudence. And here's Tom and Judy and others, and addressing the conditions. At first trying to improve conditions, and then eventually pushing for Pennhurst's closure. And eventually, after the signing of a consent decree, in 1987, Pennhurst closed. And those residents that could be moved into community living arrangements, group homes and others, were. Some few were transferred to other institutions. Today, there are questions about whether these remaining institutions will survive. And also, what do you do with the space? What do you do with these 1,000-acre campuses? And I've talked too long, I see. So let me just say that throughout American history, the history of the 20th century, Pennhurst figures prominently in a civil rights and disability rights crusade that transforms America and transforms the experiences of hundreds of thousands of people. There are some 20% of the population today said to live with a disability. And that's a whole range of different issues. And what was decided at Pennhurst helped to transform not just the law, but the life experiences of people. And it's enormously important. And there are a whole series of other controversies that I have listed here. I've about 8 different controversies, beginning with overcrowding and ending today with this question, which is relevant at Polk, it's relevant Allentown, Harrisburg, Wernersville, which is closing, Pennhurst. What do you do with these massive custodial institutions that the state financed for decades and now are empty or emptying? And it's relevant at Norristown, which is a psychiatric mental health facility. And it's a relevant issue all around the country. What does appropriate reuse really constitute? And herein we have the last of the controversies, which is the Pennhurst Asylum, which everybody is familiar with, the Halloween haunt, which has proven to be a tremendous commercial benefit to the proprietors. I take a different point of view than some about the appropriateness of the venue. I'll just put it that way. William Styron said of Auschwitz, it's inconceivable to be at Auschwitz after dark. That's a little bit the way I feel about Pennhurst and the Halloween Asylum phenomenon. But let me just end that, if you look at the court records, if you read Roland Johnson's powerful Living in a Desert World, his autobiography, and if you just talk to people, you get the clear sense that history is something that happens to people, and that Pennhurst shaped the lives of tens of thousands of people who lived and worked there. It shaped public policy, not only in Pennsylvania, but around the country. And one of the great questions that remains, and this is something that Jim Conroy is so good at, and I know that Jim is on the call. How do we remember this? What is the appropriate venue? Not only in terms of a museum as a means of remembrance at Pennhurst, but also a National Disability Rights Museum. And that's a campaign that Jim is leading now. And it's very, very important. And it all began at Pennhurst. Well, I'm sorry I've taken so much time. I feel in a sense I've only scratched the surface. Let me just say that history is something that happens to people. And you can ask big questions of little places. And particularly at Pennhurst, it is freighted with significance. We cannot underestimate the meaning or importance in Pennsylvania's past, present, and in its future. And with that, I'll be quiet. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Absolutely, Dennis. Thank you. Did you want to expand on any of the other slides that we have here?
There are just a whole series of things. No, I think we're pretty good. But there are some images there. But I think it'd be better in what time is left to hear from other people. And I'm happy to answer any questions or invite Jim and others. That was the marker dedication. Maybe we could end with that when we dedicated the marker in 2010.
Sure.
And you'll see all the principals from Tom Gilhold, Pat Clapp, Eleanor Elkin, Jim, Gene Searle, Jim Wilson, and others were there. It was quite an event.
We had many conversations going in the chat the whole time, and Jim was helping you out for much of them. So thank you, Jim.
Jim always does, and I appreciate it. I need it. Thank you, Jim.
Up with you, yes. I have quite a few questions that people had shared beforehand, so I'm going to start with those, just to stay with the order that I received them, stay as fair as possible here. The first one I got was from someone named Pam. She said, "It is understood that events at Pennhurst helped create the GCH and ICH guidelines on conducting appropriate studies on individuals. Could you expand on the procedures and studies that were actually conducted at Pennhurst in an effort to dispel false rumors?" I know you also said that Nancy might be able to help with this one.
Well, I think Nancy Thaler, who I believe is on the panel, and Jim Conroy too, but the whole idea of institutional review boards and appropriate medical and safeguards comes out of the Second World War, comes out of the Nuremberg trials, comes out of the United Nations Convention, but it also comes out of the experience of medical experimentation that occurred at Pennhurst and elsewhere. And by 1973, so great is the controversy that Pennsylvania enacts this moratorium. And aside from our book, there's really been very little written about this piece of it. But the idea of humane treatment as a standard, and eventually it's written into the United Nations Convention for People with Disabilities. But it's an outgrowth of this decades of controversy that developed in the aftermath of experiments which were commonplace and routine in institutions all across the Commonwealth and all across the country. And I don't know if there's anybody else that would like to add to that. I mean, there's a rich history in that, and you'll find some of it in the book too. But the whole idea of institutional review boards, and it was a huge controversy at medical conferences, and that's what led to the moratorium. And I'll credit Ginny Thornburg and Pat Clapp and Eleanor Elkin and the mothers for exposing this, and the callousness of some physicians who just didn't care.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have, Charlie is hoping to take a daytime tour of the Pennhurst property, but is hesitant to join the tours that are offered by the owners of the Halloween haunt for multiple reasons. Primarily considering the fictional storyline that they push in the Halloween events, would you consider the daytime tour factually credible?
Well, I've never gone on it. I do know that Jim Conroy and others are working on the creation of a museum there to improve historical accuracy. And that's a very important development. And I really applaud and salute it. I can't, I have intentionally never taken one of the tours. I've been to Pennhurst a half dozen times, but have never gone on a tour. I would think one of the daytime historical tours might be more accurate than the nighttime experience. Mm-hmm. But I would leave that to folks from Pennhurst. And you all know that Pennhurst is being converted into an industrial commercial property, but the Halloween venue and the museum will be preserved. But the rest of it someday is going to look like an industrial park. But I would leave it to others to vouch for the historical accuracy. But I know there's been a conscious effort to improve that, and I applaud that. I welcome anybody else chiming in if they have thought.
Sure, you would have to use that raise hand feature since we have the unmuting capability blocked. So just use that raise hand feature if you want to discuss anything else. Our next question, we actually have it from multiple people. Both Evelyn and are wondering how to access records that may have existed for patients when it was still open.
Well, a couple thoughts, and Greg Pierman, who is with the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, is a contact person, if you'd like. But the State Archives is the official repository for all institutional records in Pennsylvania. And I would, Tyler Stump, who is a great and imaginative archivist, would be someone to contact, or contact the archives, because they are the holder of records. And I know that there are some materials in private hands. Temple University is developing a phenomenal collection of papers, Gil Houle and Haggerty and Judge Broderick and others. But the State Archives is the repository of record. But I think that if you go to the Pennhurst Memorial Preservation Alliance website or their Facebook page, Greg Pierman, who manages that, may be of help, and Greg is very helpful. But the State Archives in Harrisburg is the repository of record, and that's where you would go.
Wonderful.
And they'll help you. It's a public archives.
How many of the buildings are still in existence, and are any of them used for anything else other than the haunt or for, the photography and tours?
Well, piece by piece, buildings have been knocked down. The administration building and several others are still standing, but a good measure of the buildings, the several dozen, have been demolished or in the process of being demolished. And but there are a whole complex, well, a number of buildings in the complex that are still standing, including the administration building. The museum site is there, in Mayflower, I guess. But most of it is being leveled and it'll be built upon someday.
That's a shame. Were there were there ever any tuberculosis patients housed at Pennhurst?
That's an interesting question because one of the two annexes was a former tuberculosis site. There was Pennhurst campus, and there were two annexes that fed residents to Pennhurst. In a formal sense, I don't know of any. In an informal sense, diagnoses were oftentimes very incomplete or incorrect regarding who had a cognitive or intellectual disability and who didn't. But in terms of, there were a number of state tuberculosis sanitariums opened, and it's more likely that people went there than to Pennhurst. Pennhurst had a very specific purpose. And even though the diagnoses, particularly in the early years, could be incorrect, sometimes politically motivated, more than likely they would have gone to one of the other state centers, which you would see on that map. And they were throughout the state. There were a number of tuberculosis sites.
Okay. I do want to point out on that last question, I did have one of the tour guides speak in the chat privately, saying that they do consider themselves an advocate for people with ID, and they do try to be as accurate and sensitive as possible. So if anyone is interested in going, you can rest assured that that is credible information.
And I think there's been a very conscious effort at that, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. Was not always the case just by looking at the website and by testimonies that you can find online and just by talking to people. I've had students who have gone there, and after they learned something of the history of Pennhurst, their feelings changed quite a lot. But I think there's a very conscious effort to improve and to be more accurate and more humane in the representations of people.
Somebody else asked, how could the Friends Asylum for Persons Deprived of the Use of Their Reason, the nation's first privately run psychiatric hospital founded in the 1800s, compare to Pennhurst?
Well, it's a great question. Every institution has its own story. I think that the ethos for much of the 19th century about compassionate care is really shaped in part by the experience of the Society of Friends in Philadelphia. And certainly the hospital is an example of that. That all begins to shift and to change, though, in the late 19th century. And whether we're talking about Byberry in particular, and there's a little book on Byberry that's really interesting to read, or Norristown, or other facilities in and around Philadelphia. The story of institutionalization in the 20th century, in many respects, is different than the story of institutionalization in the early 19th century, in part because institutions got so big, they got so complex, and the problems of underfunding and inadequate staffing. Very different than the experience when they were smaller. I don't want to say more intimate, but just the scale and the size. But Byberry was in Philadelphia, was one of the institutions, an outgrowth of psychiatric hospital, which really came in for enormous criticism. And Norristown as well. In Norristown, of course, is closing except for those who are convicted of crimes. But that's a controversy in itself, just like with Polk.
Did the parents or caregivers typically buy into the eugenics theory, or were they more forced or cajoled into this situation?
Well, there's several ways that you could be, back in the day, several ways that you could be admitted to Pennhurst. One is if the family requested it. The other is if a judge or a doctor ordered it. And in most states, there's the requirement of some kind of hearing, which oftentimes didn't occur. But for folks who were judged to be unable to give their consent, this was an involuntary commitment, which the courts will point out years later. But I don't know that families, and I say this as the father of a son with significant disabilities, families didn't necessarily buy into the eugenics mindset, though that was part of the culture and the thinking. Oftentimes is with enormous sadness, sorrow, grief, and oftentimes just being overwhelmed. That was the motivation for seeking redress, which could be different than a judge or a medical doctor or even a school official in Philadelphia. They did a survey of schools to figure out who was eligible to be transferred out of school and placed in Pennhurst or other institutions. And it's really striking to us today to think that children with a disability, so-called special needs, didn't have a right to public education until Tom Gilhool and Park and other things came along.
Let me just scroll down and see some of these most recent questions here because we're getting low on time.
And I'm sorry it went longer than I intended.
No problem. Let's see.
Well, as you're scrolling, I'll just take note that Jim Conroy is leading this national campaign for a National Disability Rights Museum, which came out of the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, and is now working with Senator Casey's office. And I was involved. I see Ed Goldman's on the call and other folks. And this will be a national effort to tell this story in Washington. And folks should be aware of that. Be another consequence of Pennhurst.
Right. I do have one person asking how much Pennhurst actually generated in revenue for the state. How much of it made up?
Well, in the 20th century, the state was investing, it looked like at one point on the order of $1.5 million to $2 million to take care of expansions at Pennhurst. And then monies for other parts of the state. So it's an enormous financial investment on the part of the state. And there are records that show that Pennhurst could return about $50,000 to the state in a good year if they were efficient in their management and care, and if they knew how to cut costs and where. And the cutting of costs really came at the expense of nutrition and other things, but also by generating anything from uniforms to mattresses to agricultural produce and whatnot. if it was well managed, many years they could turn profit of about $50,000, which either directly or indirectly went back to the state. So
I'm just going to let these last two people that are asking to speak go, and then that'll be the end for tonight. So go ahead, Joe, if you would like to speak now.
Yes, Doctor, I want to thank you so much for all your work and concern. And as you know, but my question is, what are your suggestions for advocacy? Because funding is so important. We know that people that are the vulnerable population are always the first ones attacked, i.e. cuts in Medicaid and so on and so forth. I appreciate the history, but we have to also educate people how to go forward. Thank you so much for all you've done.
well, thank you, Joe. And that's absolutely right. And it's one of the reasons why I agreed to chair this PILCOP disability policy circle. PILCOP is trying to reposition itself in the disability rights struggle today. And we've gone through a whole series of issues. And advocacy is crucial, but also bringing pressure to bear so that there are not cuts to Medicaid as had been proposed, and really massive cuts. And advocacy to assure that if people move into the community, the services are there to support them. And advocacy to assure that if someone needs residential placement, we're in a position to provide it. It's a huge undertaking. It's a huge financial undertaking. And Nancy Thaler, who's on the call, has such deep experience with this. But it begins with knowledge and awareness and being informed, and then holding our state and federal officials accountable. And it's only by collective advocacy that there's ever going to be the possibility to maintain or improve conditions. Pennsylvania, there's Jim Conroy right now. Hello, Jim. Pennsylvania has a waiting list, and it's the numbers have gone down, but there are over 12,000 people waiting for services. There is a guarantee that every student who completes high school, graduates high school with an intellectual developmental disability will be eligible for waiver support, as it's called, in some form. But issues of employment and education, social services, therapeutics, behavioral, it all costs money. And, you know, I was thinking today, William Penn talked about the holy experiment. And Pennsylvania is the foundation for all that will help you to live a satisfying and prosperous life. Those are Penn's words. Only through collective advocacy, and it's a fight, it's a struggle, can we hope to maintain and improve. And there have been great improvements. But, you know, it's how do you assure that the supports that are necessary to live a full life will be present? We all need help. Every single person needs help. We all have special needs. And that ought to be the common ground that brings us together. But Senator Casey has been just great in many respects. And I think by working with him, good things can happen, and good things are happening. But it's about compassion and caring, but it's also about knowledge and being informed and having both a historical perspective and having political common sense. And that's good advocacy.
Great. Barbara, I'm going to let you speak now. Go right ahead. Yep, I think you're unmuted. Go right ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit the button. I apologize.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
Hello.
Hello, thank you. It was great. I enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, I'm going to call that a night then. Like I said before, we are going to be sending out this recording so you can rewatch this at any time. It's available on our YouTube page. Share it however you would like. And thank you, Dennis, so much for taking time to answer all of our questions. The many hundreds of us appreciated it. And if you guys have any further questions, feel free to email me. You will have my email. Again, if you didn't notice it in your registration, you will be getting another email from me this evening with a follow-up. So feel free to reach out for anything that you need. And I hope you all have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Kelly. And please check out the Pennhurst Memorial Preservation Alliance. They are good folks doing good things. Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.